Bem-vindo e bem-vindo ao IBRACCAST, podcast de IBRAC, o Instituto Brasileiro de Estudos de Concorrência, Consumo e Comércio Internacional. Este é o programa Conversas com o Presidente, em que o nosso presidente, Renê Medrado, entrevista figuras muito relevantes das áreas de interesse do IBRAC, visando a ter suas perspectivas sobre o estágio atual e as perspectivas futuras de tais áreas, além de curiosidades profissionais e de carreira desses convidados.
Welcome to a special episode of the President's Talks, the official podcast of the Brazilian Institute for the Study of Competition, Consumer Affairs and International Trade. I'm Renê Medrado, partner at Pinheiro Neto Advogados and current president of IBRAC. Today, we are honored to welcome a distinguished guest, Frank Montag, partner of Freshfields and a leading figure in European international competition law, and, of course, a very good friend. Frank has been nominated as the leading lawyer in antitrust for many consecutive years, so it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us in this opening episode. Frank.
Hi, Renee. Many thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to discuss with you.
Excellent. Frank, the idea is for us to do this conversation in a very natural way, and we are going to cover issues involving your career, the matters, the cases that you have discussed, and also at some point we can talk about some personal interests. And our goal here is to give access to the Brazilian antitrust community to get to know you better and to know your views on where we are, especially on international antitrust. To start off, your professional background spans several areas within international economic law. Could you share with us a brief overview of your remarkable career so far?
Yeah, very happy to. I studied law in Germany and the United States after having done an international baccalaureate at the United World College of the Atlantic. I finished my law studies in Germany and then in the US with an LLM, and then I did a PhD in public international law because my, early career goal was to become a diplomat. This lasted until I did an internship with the United Nations in New York, and I found out that I was not the kind of person for working in a large public institution. And when I returned to Germany and did an internship at the law firm Deringer, I found this much more practical, and I got stuck until essentially today because Deringer later merged with Freshfields, and so I'm still there where I started many years ago. During my studies, as I said, I was focused on public international law and on EU law, but I also took antitrust law courses both in Germany and in the US. And so I've always, once I started as an associate, done some antitrust law. But then when I moved to Brussels in 1989 to open the Brussels office of the Deringer firm, everybody assumed that I was an antitrust specialist, because why would you be in Brussels without being an antitrust law specialist? And so I focused more and more on antitrust law, even though in the early days, and actually for quite a while, I did, in addition to antitrust law, I did international trade law. And the highlight of that particular part of my career was definitely advising the Mexican government on the negotiation of the free trade agreement with the European Union and its predecessor agreements. All of that lasted for a number of years. So I've always had this little, public international law and international trade law practice on the side, but over time it became basically essentially competition law.
And that's a very interesting, very curious point. As you know, I also do international trade law and competition. So what can you tell about your experience with anti-dumping cases? How was that there in the beginning of the 90s?
Yeah, I started actually my first anti-dumping cases in the late 80s, because what had happened was that one of our European clients, Bayer, a chemical company, had sold certain production assets to Mexico, to companies belonging to Grupo Alfa, one of the big private companies in Mexico, and they were supposed to pay for that with exports of the fiber that they were making on these assets to Europe. And as soon as they started doing that, competitors in Europe started an anti-dumping proceeding. And so Bayer came to us and said, well, the purchasers of our assets do need anti-dumping advice, and that's how it all took off. I think in the early days, the investigations, and I've also done a number of them for Brazilian clients, were more friendly. And you had the commission teams coming to Brazil or to Mexico or to other places for a long period of time, and you had actually a very nice relationship with them during the time they were inspecting the books of your client. And that's where you actually won the cases, on the ground, arguing the nitty-gritty, which makes all the difference when you attribute costs, whether you attribute it to one line or the other, when you ultimately look at the percentages that make up the dumping margin. So these are the early days. I think then the dumping practice moved very much, at least in Europe, towards imports from China, and it became much less interesting in many respects.
Very interesting. So what drew you to competition law in particular? Of course, you were in Brussels already, but can you tell us specifically how that transition occurred for you moving towards more competition law?
Yeah, as I said, I've always been interested in the economic aspects of the law, and competition law is really at the crossroads there. Secondly, I think competition law, as many of the important cases show, also has a political aspect. Governments get interested in it. It's got an international aspect, and all of these aspects together I find intellectually very challenging. And then in addition to that, this is what clients wanted from me. But, since that time, since the early 90s, I've also become interested in it intellectually. I've published articles and written books, and I was the chair of Studienvereinigung Kartellrecht, which is basically the sister organization to IBRAC in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria for many years. So, there's always been also this academic interest in the practice of competition law.
Okay. And you've been involved in some of the most complex and high-profile antitrust cases in Europe, from merger reviews to cartel investigations. Concerning merger review cases, you worked in landmark multi-jurisdiction cases such as Siemens Alstom, Holcim Lafarge, Adobe Figma. Can you walk us through the impact of these cases in your career and as a professional in terms of legal relevance, complexity, personal impact? We would love to hear your insights.
Yeah, if I give you a little kind of run through European merger law on the basis of my cases, I would actually start with Nestlé Perrier, which was my second phase case, 1992, and it was a case of what we called at the time collective dominance. Today you would say unilateral effects. It went through all of the second phase, and we had a remedy at the end. And it was the first case where economists were involved in a European merger case. Another kind of highlight case, at least for my career, was Bayer Aventis Crop Science. That was in the early 2000s, one of the big agricultural mergers, because there we had more than 300 affected markets, and we had to give remedies in 120 markets. So you can imagine this was an enormous case in terms of logistics. And the European Commission used it as one of the first cases to make a US-style document request, because the argument of the Commission was the Americans, the FTC, which was looking at this at the same time, they had a second request with these enormous amounts of documents. And we, European Commission, we would like to have the same documents so that we can talk to the Americans more easily. So that was another one, where I thought it kind of showed a development in merger law. two cases which I then did for the paper industry, actually one called Heindel and the other one Milikowski, both times for my client was UPM Kymmene. We went through full phase 2 investigation, and in both cases we got clearance without any remedies. One was a theory of harm of coordination of putting new capacity onto the market, which the Commission couldn't prove, and the other one was actually cleared on the basis of it because of efficiencies, even though you won't necessarily read that when you look at the decisions. So I thought these were important cases. And then we come to, you mentioned it, Holcim Lafarge. I think that one was particularly interesting because we had a $6.2 billion euro divestment in phase 1 already, which was unheard of. And then we come to cases like Dow DuPont, Bayer Monsanto, Siemens Alstom. Siemens Alstom, was super political, as you can imagine. I think it was the only case of which I know positively that it was discussed by the French president, the German chancellor, and the president of the European Commission together at a meeting of the Council of Ministers. So, that was very political. I still believe the Commission decided it wrongly, in particular in the market for high speed. Very happy to explain why, but maybe that's too much detail. And then in recent years, I would mention Cargotec Konecranes. That was a merger which we had to notify in many, many countries, which the Commission cleared after a very, very detailed investigation based on remedies with a 630-page decision, and where the CMA blocked it. And the CMA basically didn't have much reason other than, as they said to me behind closed doors, they wanted to show their sovereignty, and they wanted to show that they were there. So that was an interesting case. Then Adobe Figma, you mentioned that already. Interesting theories of harm, in particular the one on potential competition. And most recently, I think one case I could mention is Bunge v. Terra, which was also a case in Brazil, and which recently at the ICN conference in Edinburgh in May had a dedicated session just to itself, which shows the importance of in particular cases concerning the food supply chain for many countries. So that's kind of a broad overview of some of the highlight cases I did during the years on the merger front.
Very interesting, and it of course the development of areas such as antitrust, they are much more geared through the cases. So it's good to see and to hear about your experience. You have defended, as we know, many clients in recent cartel investigations of the European Commission regarding blockchains and ethylene, to give an example. Can you talk about particularities of cartel enforcement in Europe? Any other specific relevant aspects of these investigations?
Yeah, very happy to. And indeed, cartel cases were at the beginning of my antitrust career. I did the PVC case, and the PVC case actually took from start to end, from the dawn rate of the Commission till the final judgment of the European Court of Justice, 19 years of my career. I had hoped to retire on it, but the court ended it too early. Anyway, interesting that you mentioned blockchains and ethylene, kind of two recent cases which actually are part of a new development, if you want, where we see that the European Commission goes after cartels that are borderline cases, that are in the gray zone. Because apparently there are not that many, hardcore price or market allocation cartels anymore. I think companies essentially learned their lesson. And so the Commission is going into areas where companies actually have to cooperate with each other, like in blockchains. Another case would be, the AdBlue case, the standard setting case in the automotive industry, where companies need to cooperate and therefore they need to exchange information. And where the Commission says, well, but they have just gone a little bit too far, and then it's a cartel. And similarly, ethylene was not a kind of a classic cartel, but it was a purchasing cartel, where some people say actually a purchasing cartel leads to lower prices for consumers. So where's the problem? But the commission, not finding enough classic cases anymore, is moving into these borderline areas.
Talking about these borderline cases, especially on areas where where companies need to cooperate, how do you see the role of the authority when the authority needs to make sure that the companies know what is acceptable? So it's a way of educating the companies and showing what is permitted, what is not, and when begins the prerogative to investigate, especially in situations where the line is not clear. So especially we are dealing with business, and business need direction, or at least to know how the authority thinks.
Yeah, indeed. Obviously, as you say, guidance from the authorities is helpful for companies. And for example, the European Commission is doing so in a relatively extensive way. If you think about the horizontal cooperation guidelines, which is a very, very big, thick document providing guidance in all kinds of areas. That being said, there is always a borderline somewhere between what the guidance still sees as lawful and what everybody would regard as a hardcore cartel. There's always a borderline somewhere, and it's very hard for the authorities to define it exactly, even though they want to be as clear as possible. So there will always be cases when they start to switch from advising companies on their behavior to saying, well, this is a violation and we must investigate. And we see, by the way, a recent trend here that the Commission, because there are fewer leniency applications, they have now started to run an economic monitoring program where they have, for example, looked at hundreds of thousands of earning calls, recorded them, then run them through an artificial intelligence tool, through an algorithm, who kind of search them for things like market discipline, price discipline, or other terms. And then on the basis of that, they identified the tire industry as particularly prone to using these terms. And then they actually started an investigation with dawn rates based on this review of the language and the earning calls. And this was just actually yesterday approved by the General Court, in the sense that Michelin had appealed the decision of the Commission to order the dawn rate and said, you cannot base a dawn rate decision on such flimsy evidence like earnings calls for analysts. And the General Court of the EU yesterday said, yes, you can. Actually, if you find plausible reasons to suspect that these calls are being used to signal to each other, then you can do it. So basically, the Commission's new policy to start investigations also without leniency applications was validated by the court.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like going back to parallelism plus that we discussed a lot back in the day. And then
exactly.
many authorities realized that was not very efficient in terms of enforcement. And then, of course, the how to get to direct evidence became the norm. But seems like as technology moves, we may have the authorities are willing to go back to those devices to obtain circumstantial or economic evidence. So let's see how that will lead us, where that will lead us. Very good. For cartel investigations, you have recently written an article about leniency and ex officio investigations. Can you talk about that topic as well, please?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's following nicely the conversation we just had, because why does the Commission, go to these ex officio investigations using new technology? It's because they have fewer and fewer leniency applications. Leniency applications have been down, at least on the European level, for quite a number of years, also in many member states. Apparently, last year there was a little bit of an uptick, but we still need to see the cases coming out of that. There are also always industries like the construction industry where you will apparently find people who are unable to learn, and therefore there will be leniency applications because there are still hardcore cartels. But by and large, I think at least the big companies have learned their lesson very well of all the large fines in the early 2000s or so, and have compliance programs and really try to make sure that there are no hardcore cartels anymore. And since that is the case, there are fewer leniency applications, and that has two effects. One, as we discussed, the Commission is going into the gray areas, and the other one, as we also discussed, the Commission is using more artificial intelligence and other tech tools in order to start ex officio investigations.
Thank you, Frank, for that. Let's turn to enforcement trends. How do you see, what's your perspective on the current state of competition law? How would you describe the evolution of antitrust enforcement over the past decade? You touched on that point right now, on the decline of leniencies and how the authorities are trying to cope with that. But can you elaborate on how you see the current state of competition law in a broad view?
Yeah, very happy to. I think there are a number of trends. One is we have seen, again at the beginning of the 2000s in Europe, following 3 court judgments in Airtrust first choice, Schneider Legrand and Tetra Laval, which the Commission all 3 lost, merger cases. We saw a development of bringing in more economics to cases. The Commission, created the chief economist team and the role of the chief economist, and there was, for I'd say 15 plus years, a lot of attention paid to economic theory, how it developed and how it might apply in cases. Now, in recent years, on the merger side, what we see is that internal documents now trump every time what economists may say. So, I would put the kind of the heyday of economic theory in merger cases to, the telecoms cases and Dow DuPont, with the innovation theory of harm, which was very much based on economic thinking with a 50% economic analysis annexed to the decision of the Commission. But today, it's simpler theories of harm, and it's in particular internal documents that are important. Second trend that I see is there is an only partially successful power grab by antitrust authorities. What do I mean by that? They try to extend their jurisdiction by coming up with new tools or theories to capture what they call killer acquisitions, which would normally fly under their thresholds, under their radar. In the EU, the famous case is Illumina Grail, where the Commission, through an extensive interpretation of the merger control regulation, said, well, a member state that is itself not competent because, for example, a merger case does not meet its threshold, can nevertheless refer to the Commission, which is also not competent because otherwise it would have been there in the first place. And therefore, a non-competent state can refer a case to a non-competent authority that then becomes competent. And the European Court of Justice ultimately stopped that. So that was not so successful. But at the same time, the Court of Justice also said, what we actually believe to be, no longer possible, that in a merger case that, for example, doesn't meet the thresholds and therefore cannot be looked at under the UMR, member states can apply Article 102, the abuse of dominance provision, after the fact, and can say, oh, this merger, which has not been looked at under merger control, was an abuse of the dominant position of the acquirer, the mere fact that it acquired a competitor, and therefore we can go after it. That's the Tower Cast judgment. And then the third development that you see in this area of power grabbing is more and more countries introducing call-in powers. Like, for example, the Italians, but there are a number of other countries in Europe which have these call-in powers as well, which essentially allow you to call in any merger you like, if you see a certain nexus to your country, and which, of course, is a death nail to legal certainty, because you never know when somebody might call in a case, and then as the Italians have done, call it in. Don't look at that yourself, but then refer it up to the Commission, which could otherwise the European Commission not have looked at it. So that's kind of the big trend number 2. And the other, big trend that I see is competition law becomes more political. Many listeners of the podcast will have heard about the famous Draghi report. Mr. Draghi, a former president of the European Central Bank and Italian Prime Minister, wrote a report last year commissioned by the president of the European Commission about, why is Europe falling behind the United States and certain Asian countries, and what needs to be done. And he found that there's an innovation gap, there's a productivity gap, and in order to close this, he proposed a number of measures. And in this group of measures that he proposed, he also proposed that resilience, the green transition, innovation should form part of competition law, merger control decisions to allow for the creation of European champions. So politics is coming into antitrust law, and I do think we see that also in the UK, where the CMA was told to kind of foster the government's growth strategy. We see that in the US, where apparently the White House is interfering in merger control decisions, decisions or cases of the agencies. So these are the mega trends which I'm currently seeing.
No, very interesting. I would ask now if you see any convergence in competition policy trends in Europe and other jurisdictions. I see when you mention about the more use of internal documents, that of course somehow approximates the EU practice to the US practice, where of course internal documentation of the companies, especially on a discovery type proceeding, is really important. So would you identify other convergence? And if I can already also mention, what would you see the biggest challenges or opportunities for competition law worldwide? If you can talk about digital markets, sustainabilities, and elaborate a little bit more on geopolitics and its influence on antitrust.
Yeah, I think there are both tendencies a little bit, some convergence and some divergence. Divergence, if I go back to what we just discussed, this power grab for jurisdictions interpreting their law very extensively, goes for me a little bit against, the foundations of the ICN. We built the ICN in order to overcome that many countries were looking at the same merger, often with a very, very flimsy local nexus. And what's happening now is that until we had, the recommended practices, which had an enormous success, I had the pleasure of being an ICN delegate NGA since actually the first ICN conference. I was watching, how countries adopted these policies, and there was this convergence, but now in the last few years, I see that there is more divergence, at least with respect to the jurisdictional criteria. Then, when it comes to the tech world, I think we see both. We see, on the one hand, a convergence, because there are quite a number of countries now, and I think that Brazil is among them, which either already start based on the existing law investigations against what we call the gatekeepers or the GAFAM, or whatever acronym we want to use, basically on similar theories that the European Commission has used either under Article 102 or now under the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. And then in a number of these countries, and I believe Brazil again is an example of that, there's a discussion about whether it would make sense to introduce regulation along the lines of the DMA in order to speed up, abuse investigations, which otherwise take too long. And Japan is looking at it, Turkey is looking at it, I think South Korea is looking at it. So there's a convergence, if you want. At the same time, when you look at the US, I think there's a divergence to some extent, because the US is criticizing heavily the European Union for using the DMA, because they are saying, look, this is only applied essentially to American tech companies, and you use it like an additional tax because you impose high fines, and this is targeted against us. So you should no longer do this. This has a little bit of this sentence, this is my dog and I'm the only one who is allowed to kick it, because at the same time we know that the US government is continuing the litigation against Google for breaking it up, and litigation against some of the other big tech companies as well. So they're basically saying, you Europeans, hands off, but we take care of this ourselves. At the same time, Ferguson, the chair of the FTC, he said, actually, the US system, which is based on court decisions, where you have to go to court, the agency has to go to court, and then the court has to decide based on the evidence, is much superior to the European system and that of many other countries, which is an administrative system, because you don't guarantee the rights of the defense. Now, the Europeans are, of course, vigorously opposing this, but again, you see completely divergent views on the application of the antitrust law. So, I think it's a bit of a patchwork. It's not clearly going into the convergence area, as some of this may suggest, but also not clearly going into the divergence area.
No, this is fantastic. As for Brazil, yes, we do have the Bill of Law that is, as we based on the conversations we had with the Minister of Finance, the Bill of Law with respect to digital platforms will probably be submitted at any time to Congress. So the second semester we'll have lots of things to discuss, and what was the legislative option of the Brazilian competition. We know that CADE will probably be the authority that will conduct the investigations with respect to big techs, so it'll be something for us to monitor and see how that develops. Okay, Frank, with respect to career, we certainly have many young lawyers and students listening to this episode of the IBRACCAST. We actually have within IBRAC a IBRAC Junior, which is a committee directed to young lawyers, and I think they would certainly want to hear from you any career advice, for newly graduated lawyers and economists that are going toward a career in competition law or international trade.
Yes, I think when we look at the future and careers in the future, the one most important aspect, I think a new aspect, disruptive aspect of it, is AI, artificial intelligence. I think knowledge workers as we all know, are among the groups most easily replaced by agents. Just recently, a couple of weeks or months ago, the Law Society in the UK admitted the first pure AI law firm where clients only and exclusively have interaction with an agent or chatbot, but no longer with a physical person for small claims. But it is a law firm entirely based on artificial intelligence. So a lot of the things that we are doing today will be taken over by intelligence, by artificial intelligence, and therefore a young lawyer or economist should really, immerse him or herself into this new technology, understand it, use it, be at the forefront of using it, and be tech savvy, because those who are will stand the best chances for a long period of satisfying work and a good career in the law. Now, obviously, AI isn't everything, and we shouldn't, forget the basis of lawyering. The science-based evaluation of evidence, the engaged representation of our clients, the ethical underpinnings of being a lawyer, being a member of the justice system. And many of these aspects cannot be replaced by AI, easily. But that's the basic. Everybody should be doing that. But on top of it, I think for young lawyers, young economists, tech is really very, very important. They need to understand it, and they need to understand how to make use of it.
Very good. That was a very interesting development in the UK. I'll take a look at that acceptance of a AI-only law firm. That's very interesting for all of us lawyers to know about it. Well, Frank, thank you very much for this rich, thoughtful conversation. It's been an honor to learn from your experience and perspectives. I have to, end this conversation by asking you a recommendation of a legal article or book. But before I do that, can you tell us if you have any hobby that you would like to mention? I know one, but I'll let you mention that.
Yeah, I like to play golf, although I play badly, and I like to ski. That is, those are my two hobbies, and I like to collect every now and then a piece of modern art. But otherwise, it's the law.
Excellent. And your recommendation of a legal article or book, or legal work, or fiction or no fiction?
Yeah, I think recently I read an article by Ariel Etzraki and Victoria Robertson, and it was on. The title was "Can Competition Law Save Democracy? Reflections on Democracy Tech-Driven Decline and How to Stop It." And it discusses the fact that new technologies actually, because of fake news and because of the way information is disseminated, can be really bad for democracy, and how competition law, by taking into account outside goals in the evaluation of, for example, an abuse, can help to strengthen democracy, or to resist the erosion of democracy through these tendencies in new tech. So I found this was a very interesting article that I can recommend.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Frank, this week we just had the meeting with the organizing committee for the next IBRAC competition conference, which will take place October 1st to 3rd. It will be a fantastic event again. It will be in São Paulo. And soon we will announce what were the panels that were chosen in a blind review process. So mark in our calendar. If you're able to come to Brazil for that, would be fantastic. And And thank you very much for this talk. I very much enjoyed and hope you have a good day. Well, I hope also our listeners, if you can give us your final words before I close, be happy for that.
Well, my final word would only be to thank you very much, Renee, for having me on your show. And, it's been a pleasure discussing these interesting topics of competition law and policy and actually beyond, and the future. So I look forward to seeing you very soon and perhaps at the IBRAC conference in October.
Absolutely. Thank you, Frank. Well, I hope our listeners enjoyed this special episode of the President's Talks with Frank Montag. Don't forget to follow us for future episodes and updates from IBRAC. Thank you very much. Until next time.
Obrigada por nos acompanhar. Não perca o próximo episódio, em que conversaremos com mais um convidado de Conversas com o Presidente. Até breve!